Hey everybody, it's Tony Zayas. Welcome to another episode of the Tech Founder Show, where we talk with exciting tech founders who are really leading innovation. They're on the bleeding edge of technology and innovation and changing the way we work, the way we live, the way we play. As always, I'm joined by Andy Halko. Andy, looks nice out there. How was your fourth?
Fourth was great. I figured it's so nice and hot outside. I'd join you from my estate in the plains of Cleveland. So I figured it'd be a fun and good show to be outside today.
Yeah, awesome.
We're gonna have to wipe off some of the sweat, though.
Yeah, looks hot out there. Cool. Well, today, we've had a few founders on this show talking about AI, machine learning, and we have another one that I'm super excited to have on today. We have Richard Boyd. He's the co-founder and CEO of Tanjo AI, and where they're teaching people how machine learning and automation are changing their industries and building solutions to keep organizations ahead of the curve. So I'm super excited to hear more. I'm going to bring him on. Richard, how are you doing?
I'm great. Contrast to Andy, I'm in my basement lair that I've been hunkered down in for the last 18 months, but I'm starting to go above ground too, just like Andy. Getting some sun, some vitamin D.
Like the groundhog, I figured I'd come out and then I'll head back in. So,
yeah, outstanding.
Very cool. Well, thank you, Richard, for joining us. If you can, just let's cue this up. Maybe if you tell us the origin of Tanjo, where did the concept come from, and what is, how did it manifest, and tell us a bit about the business.
Sure. Yeah, I'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version, although it's sort of a 30-year compressed story. I've been very fortunate to work with the same team of really smart people. I try to collect smart people like yourselves around me as I tilt at the windmills of technology out there. But I've worked in the film industry. I've worked in computer games. My co-founders here and I helped create game companies like Red Storm Entertainment with Tom Clancy, and companies with Michael Crichton and science fiction writer Douglas Adams and Ozzy Osbourne. And only one of those four is still alive, so I'll let you guys ruminate on that. But also in aerospace, Lockheed Martin, 100-year-old aerospace company, bought my last company where we were working with this gaming technology, which had AI as a component, right? If you're going to make convincing worlds with convincing characters inside, you must have mastered what was the old form of AI, which is really just rules-based engines and behavior trees and finite state machines, all that stuff. But while I was at Lockheed Martin, I hung around longer than I expected. Normally if you sell a company to a big company like that, they put these little gold pots out every 6 months to keep the key personnel in place. So I thought, well, I'll stay here 2 years until the gold pots are all gone, but stayed 6 years because it was really interesting. I created a group there called Virtual World Labs that worked in AI, VR, and AR. And we were just busy coming up with technologies. We found out every time you file a patent, you get a check. So we just started inventing stuff in that field. And it was then that I discovered machine learning. And that's really what brought me to where I am today. I knew machine learning existed already, of course, but around 2009, I got invited out to Microsoft Research Labs in San Francisco with Alex Kipman, the inventor of the Microsoft Kinect system, if you remember that. I don't think it's around anymore, but anyway. And Jaron Lanier, the guy who came up with the term VR, right? You may have seen out, you probably have already interviewed him, you guys. If you haven't, you should. He's weird and cool, interesting, smart. So it was there I realized that this really is more than a new button on the calculator. It's something that machine learning is a new way to solve problems. It's why we have, automated vehicles today at the level they are, and other kinds of technologies. So shortly after playing with that at Lockheed, I jumped out and with my co-founders formed this company to take it to the rest of the market. That was 2014.
I would like to ask, and there's a lot to go into with your past and kind of the evolution, but I would like to hear just early on here before we dive more into the conversation of machine learning, AI. What are the what's the biggest like progress that you've seen in that field in your time, because you've been at this for a while?
Yeah, well, I'd say, the methodologies we built around how we train the systems, because of course, with your audience, I'm sure they already understand the difference between the old AI and the new AI. The old AI was, you don't start telling the computer what to do until a human understands it, or a team of humans, and then we sit down and put it into some kind of brittle logic and try to tell the machine what to do. But it turns out we don't know how humans drive cars. We don't know how humans do, how we do a lot of other things. This new methodology of teaching a machine to play Atari games or Go or anything just from a large set of examples, that's a new way to solve the problem. But when we worked on when I was out, viewing the Microsoft Connect project, I shouldn't say I worked on it. I was there admiring it. Let's call it that. It was like 224,000 hours of processor time to teach a system what a living room was. And there were millions of examples of what does an Asian living room or a South American living room or a rural versus an urban living room look like? What's the difference between a cat and a dog and a lamp and a chair? Stuff that we think, well, I know what those things are, but machines were still really, really awful at that. And we didn't have good labeled data sets. But today you can let a machine learning system basically watch 100 hours of video about driving a car, and it can go out there and just drive. So the better labeled data sets, but also I think some of the methods, with layered neural nets to process and learn hierarchical systems of learning that work more or less like the way we think the brain works. Is allowing us to have breakthroughs at a greater pace than any of us predicted. And I think that's one thing that I've learned from my 30 years working in these technologies is, even back in 2015, a lot of us were surveyed about, when do you think a machine will win at Texas Hold'em poker, or some of these big MMOG games like StarCraft that required diplomacy and deceit. And we were like, oh, that is 10 years, 15 years off. And it all happened like in rapid succession. Like the Game of Go thing, I think, was in 2015. And then StarCraft and Draw Poker were like 17. And it's just all happening way faster than any of us predict. So, and those are experts trying to make predictions, which I think is interesting. I think we experts are really bad at predicting. But it's happening fast and it's accelerating. So that's why conversations like this are important, I think.
Yeah, I think I actually heard a podcast about how experts are so bad at predicting things. But, speaking about breakthroughs, I'm interested in, what were the turning points? What in the last 5 years was, a discovery, a breakout, a technology that was a turning point? And then I'd be curious where you think the next big turning point is.
Yeah, so it's pretty clear for us. While I was still at Lockheed, the Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, walked across DC, I guess, from Maryland or wherever the heck he is, over to Lockheed Martin and said, "Hey, we have this big thorny problem. Do you have like innovative people who can help us solve it? We have think about everything in the Library of Congress and everything at the Smithsonian, and we're going through this digital transformation. We're digitizing everything, all the where the Ark of the Covenant is stored and stuff like that. We're scanning it, 3D scanning stuff or 2D scanning documents. And we've got experts labeling it so it can be discovered by people later. But it's taking way too long. So how can you create something that can learn from what's already been tagged and learn how to auto tag things going forward with some kind of, a level of confidence assigned to it? So we built a system to do that. And our breakthrough there was just understanding that, most humans, again, breaking away from the human way of thinking about things and trying to solve the problem more like a machine would, right? Machines have a massive amount of storage, massive amount of bandwidth available to them today, especially distributed systems. So they don't really deal with tasks. They don't have to deal with tasks with the same constraints that humans do, right? So, if a human read War and Peace, right, you might say, well, this is a Russian novel by Tolstoy. It's about war. It's about love. And you might even stop there, right? And it's really long. But machines can tag it with way more things. So we came up with a system. First of all, we used 999 weighted conceptual tags. So that, why 999? Well, that's the number of classifications in the Dewey Decimal System. So we just figured, okay, that's all human knowledge. But now the system has expanded it to 4,000. So we think of that as a thumbprint. It's a sort of hyperdimensional fingerprint around that thing. It can be a Grecian urn or War and Peace or any collection of documents with people working on it. But that fingerprint allows us now to surface things much more quickly and map it with or connect it with a higher degree of confidence and fidelity than we could with stuff that was tagged by humans. And a lot of the labeled data sets that we're still training our machine learning systems on today are hand labeled by humans. We need to break past that, and we already have, I think, to where the machines auto tag. And they're tagging with these really, really large they're way overdoing it, right? But it gets really, really interesting when you get into semantic language problems and different sort of contextual areas. So that was a big, hopefully that's meaningful enough for your audience, but that was a big breakthrough for us. It's just that one little step of like, hey, we don't have to tag it with 7 things. Let's see how many the machine wants to tag it with, and let's go with that. Then the next breakthrough, and I'll just add one more that's been really interesting, is we figured out that the way we were mapping like documents at the Library of Congress and stuff like that for the Learning Registry, the machine could not tell the difference between a document or an object or a person. So we started getting really interested in that. In fact, we almost made a dating app early on, like 2014, 15, because we let our system just crawl all over OkCupid back before everything got locked down, right? And basically it came up with these little Myers-Briggs like models of all the people on the site. And now you just got to figure out, okay, what kinds of people and physical traits and everything connect better with others. And at the time, there was no machine learning or AI in dating apps. We just decided that's not what we wanted to do with our time and energy and focus and treasure and blood. But it was really interesting. So one of the things we do today, though, with Tanjo is we make animated personas of people for market research. We just got we were a finalist for the X Prize Pandemic Response Challenge around modeling human behavior. So if you're in the state of North Carolina and we can figure out what are the largest groups of people here, what prevailing, values, traditions, feelings do they have, who are their influencers, and how do we move them to the desired behavior of using protective equipment, social distancing, getting vaccines, all that stuff. So to me, that's one of the highest moral purposes of this tech, right? Is not just predicting the future, but hoping to, create a better one.
I'm surprised the number of contextual tags for the Library of Congress wasn't 42, since that is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. But
sometimes we superimpose that in honor of Douglas, who I miss him greatly. But we did. But I can tell you there was one project we did for a chicken company. They were like, well, we basically have 4 kinds of chicken buyers. And we're like, 4? Why don't you have 126 million? Well, how about one model for every household in the US? Because I've got all this amazing tech, all this amazing storage. I can build that. I can tell you the body mass index of every household in the United States, for example. What do you do with that? I don't know. But we just tried to explain that, hey, we have these superpowers now. So why do you only have 6 kinds of chicken buyers? They're like, well, this is our market research and we really had to make it workable. We're like, hey, let's go see what the machine thinks. And that's one of the processes we go through. We call it the new scientific method, right? Old scientific method is a human comes up with an hypothesis, you design some experiments, you test against it. Well, what we do now is we throw all the data at the machine learning system, collection of brains actually, and say, find every hypothesis you think is interesting. And then the human goes through and says, oh, that looks cool. And then let it iterate on that. And you find new views, new perspectives on data that we've never had before we had this tech. So we ended up saying, though, that long story short is there aren't, in fact, not a surprise, 126 million meaningfully different ways to buy chicken, turns out. But it's also not 6. it's a larger number. We ended up drawing the line at 42 because we thought that was a nice little Easter egg insider thing. But it could have been any number between 42 and like 90.
That's great.
So I'd be interested, Richard, in hearing just more about the work that you guys are doing at Tanjo. Looking at your site, it's super interesting. I like the statement there. It says, humans are good at some tasks, computers at other. We're here to empower humans, machine learning powered decision support. So how do you guys do that? And what does that look like? Who are you working with?
Yeah, we've got a lot of government contracts. And that's where it's getting incredibly interesting. But I'll just say that the originating sort of thesis statement was that in this century, the most critical problem everybody needs to solve, whether you're an individual or you're a company or you're a government, is how to strike the right balance between machine intelligence and human intelligence. What's that balance to perform whatever task you're doing? And if you're not looking across everything constantly and making that decision, because it changes frequently, like every month, every 3 months, something like that. And like I said, is accelerating. You're not going to be competitive very soon. So we look, we're not trying to solve all the problems in the world. There's lots of people working on process automation and things like that. We've done a lot of that initially, but we really enjoy using it to help people be smarter. So that amplifying intelligence bit. So we're, for example, tying all 58 community colleges in North Carolina together with this one sort of all-seeing, all-knowing brain. And the general idea there is anytime someone at, any of the 10,000, 11,000 faculty of these 58 different institutions goes to a conference or reads something or collects some bit of new intelligence, creates a new curriculum about 3D printing or drone management or whatever, it becomes part of the whole collective intelligence. And if someone starts working on something like trying to create a new curriculum on 3D printing, this thing would automatically say, hey, it looks like you're trying to do this. Here's a bunch of stuff that's recently been added, and other people have upvoted this bit of technology or this information object as being really useful. Grab it first. Don't recreate work that's already been done. And we're still exploring, like, what kind of effect might that have on the GDP of the state to have that connected tissue with all of the intelligence being gathered, so that organizational knowledge is not lost every time someone leaves, or because you're at a school in one part of the state and you don't realize there's you're trying to teach marine biology, and the Cape Fear community college has a whole bunch of great curricula around that, and you didn't even know about it because you don't even have the ability to search there. So we have ways of connecting the knowledge that also preserve privacy and are GDPR compliant and all that, and people can actually be thoughtful about things that they want to contribute, but it's not feeling invasive. So that's one really interesting thing. And the other is this idea of taking the data exhaust that all humans leave behind out there and turning it into these models of people, which you can then put into simulations. Really powerful idea. And again, harkens back to our gaming idea, the stuff that we were doing in gaming. But really powerful and interesting. Again, if you're trying to manage your way through a pandemic and you're the governor of a state, wouldn't it be helpful to know how people really are thinking, feeling, who their influences are, what are their perspectives, and what are the sets of micro messages I can deliver over a period of time to nudge them towards the better behavior through the conduits that make sense to them and don't come in as this foreign, like, you will do this or else, because that's not how people unfortunately make decisions and govern their behavior. But so to me, that's really, really interesting, is that modeling of populations and tried to guide them along, benevolent paths.
Yeah, like that, nudge, where if you tell somebody that 9 out of 10 of their neighbors paid their taxes, instead of, threatening them with a fine, they're more likely to pay because you find that out through data, right?
Yeah, or find something they care about and then start messaging there. I usually tell this, it would take me a while to tell it, but there's a whole story around kale I tell, just to use a sort of, neutral example. 6 years ago, the number one buyer of kale in the United States was Pizza Hut, and it wasn't for eating. It was just for putting on the ice around the salad bar because it stays green a long time. They started using technologies like this. They created the American Kale Growers Association, which had a membership of one, which was a PR firm, and just started nudging people and figuring out like who are the susceptible populations who we can get to eat more kale. Who are their influencers? Oh, it's Gwyneth Paltrow, it's whoever. So let's have Gwyneth Paltrow do a cookbook and get on Rachel Ray talking about it. Next thing you know, people are walking into restaurants demanding massage, like they do in Cleveland, Andy. They walk in and they demand massage kale with a carbon neutral footprint at $15 a plate, right?
All the time. So you mentioned GDPR and intrusiveness. I'm curious, do you think AI, machine learning, improve privacy or make it a little bit more exposed, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, like so many powerful technologies we have and we develop, Marshall McLuhan talks about the tools we make making us. It is a double-edged sword. So it's incredibly powerful. And I think that's, when I talk to policymakers, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to join the Atlantic Council. If you guys are not familiar with what's going on there, it's one of our Atlantic Council members was just on Bill Maher recently. We're really trying to, the whole mission is, be bold, be benevolent. And what was the other one? Forgotten it. Anyway, is to really do good with the tech and nudge it all towards good behavior that is, like I said, overall benevolent and has some thought around the policy, because policy typically trails any technology by 10 years. But when I talk to someone at like the Joint AI Center for the military here, I started early on urging them, like, look, this isn't like other tech that you've bought. It's not like an ERP system or, Microsoft Word and Excel and things like that. It is incredibly intimate. It only works well when it has a deep understanding of your organization. So for God's sake, make sure it's inside your firewall in some fashion, even if that is a firewall that extends out into the cloud, but it has to be under your control. And you should be taking a lot of care with how it is trained, again, to avoid bias and other kinds of potentially malevolent outcomes, and then understand how it's making its predictions, how it's making its judgments, and make sure that they're consistent with your values. But if you're doing that as a SaaS thing and you're lobbing your data off somewhere and it goes into a black box and you don't know what's happening, that's a huge mistake. So it's really intimate, it's really powerful. Therefore, and that was a decision we made early on that was a differentiator, is when we work with like the community colleges in North Carolina, we go, here's source code. So this thing that we're going to take our original source code, we're going to modify it a bit to meet your needs, and then it becomes yours to manage. But you're crazy if you don't have that source, if you don't have that deep visibility into how the thing is working. I don't understand people who buy machine learning who don't get that.
Another word that you said, benevolent, stuck out to me. And so years ago, something that just stuck in my head was the singularity. The idea that you hit that point where machine learning AI matches humans, and then there's just this huge offshoot of knowledge and the ability to solve problems and invent and do all of these things. I'm curious, your opinion on this idea of the singularity and where it is, and what that looks like for us and humanity, if it's a real thing.
Yeah, this actually started with Werner Vinge out of in San Diego, right? Who wrote about that first, and then it was sort of saying basically the technological singularity is the last invention humans will ever have to make, or what we call AI plus. Once you create a self-improving AI, we will, hopefully they'll keep us around, right? And the reason it's called a singularity is because beyond that point, we can't really make predictions. It's already getting difficult to make predictions, as I pointed out earlier. Then, of course, Ray Kurzweil picked that up with The Singularity is Near, a book that he wrote early on. And I gravitated towards him at that time, tried to collect him into my posse of really smart people, started going to the Singularity conferences and things like that, meeting people there. And I came away convinced that it's inevitable, that we're going to get there at some point. And although I still have that problem, like a lot of experts do, of thinking that it's further off, because I'm working with it every day and I'm going, it's hard to believe that this thing I have that I'm running over here is actually going to be sentient anytime soon.
Right.
But it is already self-improving. And that's where it gets weird. The first time I built a persona of Victor Hugo early on. I just pointed at our system at everything he'd ever written, everything written about him, all of his private letters, everything. I also did my dad, by the way, when he died in 2017. So I've done a little speaking tour around him across South America and places around like this. There's this version of my dad that lives on a server that I can go visit, and I can talk to him now. And he talked back, he'll speak with me from whatever data is informing him. But early on, when we had Victor Hugo, we had a couple of weird moments where he started his interest graph changed and evolved. And we're still contemplating the philosophical sort of implications of that, right? What does that mean? And we have, I can't say the name of it, but we have some contracts with some acronymed agencies here in the United States with our partner NCI up in DC. And we're modeling like all the world leaders, right? So imagine taking a lot of data about world leaders. I can't describe how it's done, but then you end up with this like animated person, which you can then put into a simulation, and you can say like, okay, what if this happens? What if Turkey gets invaded, or what if the Ukraine, what if we start putting nuclear missiles at the Ukraine? How's Vladimir Putin likely to respond? And it'll give you this sort of Monte Carlo distribution of potential things he might do. And that's really informative. And the better your models are, the more interesting it gets. And that's the world we're in now. It's a very different, little scary. And that's why we need groups like the Atlantic Council thinking about how do we keep this, sort of bending towards a benevolent, outcome, better, optimal outcomes for everybody, and not going off the rails.
So
how does what you're doing? Go ahead, Tony.
No, go ahead, Andy.
Well, I was just curious how what you're doing in AI plays into the deepfake world too. I'm so intrigued by deepfake and what's possible, and to be honest, more the scary parts of deepfake to me. So it sounds like what you're doing touches that a lot potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really have to come up with countermeasures against items, things like that. Again, what we're trying to do, and I can't go into it too much, but you think about some of the issues out there like human trafficking and cyber warfare and those areas, having a bunch of systems that can sort of detect and ensnare the bad actors out there by behaving in a certain way is how we're trying to use it for good. But can that technology be used to for disinformation, for what we really now call information warfare? Absolutely. And very successfully, by the way. It turns out it's not very difficult at all to manipulate people along take that example I gave of kale, but take it towards like believing that you really need to go into that pizza shop and shoot everybody inside because they have a child trafficking ring at the bottom of it. And that's someone who got manipulated over time with micro messages. It wasn't one well-crafted email. It was a bunch of micro messages that they slowly didn't even realize they were adopting over time, like dark green vegetables are better for you. Yeah, but kale tastes bad. But Rachel Ray has a recipe for making it taste better. And Gwyneth Paltrow likes it. And then next thing you know, you're going, I should eat kale. And you can't even remember why you have that new position when iceberg lettuce was fine 18 months ago. But all of a sudden, that's your new position. And some people will argue about like, why aren't you eating kale, Andy? You need to be eating kale. I was like, well, why do I need to be eating kale? Because all these, I don't remember, but I just know, right? And it's easy to do that. So we got to come up with countermeasures and not be too squeamish about those countermeasures to make sure we don't lose these information warfare battles.
Well, one thing I always think is that, I don't know, ego of Americans, people that I talk to, is that we're ahead of technology, we're inventing these things, we're going to set the tone. But I always think like all it takes is one bad actor out there, a couple, to really innovate way ahead of us and just, do anything and cause anything they want. I mean, is that something you ever think of as a real fear?
No, absolutely. And I think that looking at the international sort of distribution of work in this field, it is not U.S. centric. In fact, I would say, I don't want to get in too much trouble here, but it seems to be weighted much towards parts of Asia right now than most people would be comfortable with. So we should have a lot of humility. It feels to me, and I'm not the only one talking about this, that it's almost like the Sputnik kind of challenge, right? That, hey, we're behind in the space race and we better catch up. So let's make some really thoughtful investments. I think that's where we are in the US right now, especially at the government level. That's why some of the, we just got a 7-year, $800 million contract with GSA together with NCI and Leidos and others to be thoughtful around machine learning, AI, and digital transformation. And so there are big investments happening in that space. And DARPA and other R&D groups that are truly doing real capital R, real capital D are spending a lot of time there. So I'm hopeful that we'll be able to catch up and at least maintain parity. But I do feel like even now we're behind.
That's a super interesting parallel, as you said, Sputnik and the race to space and all that. Super interesting just to think about. The question that I'm curious about is, with all the both potential for good and for bad and for the unknown, is you mentioned like the Atlantic Council. Who are the other players? Who is involved in the process of ensuring that as a community, those of you that are involved in AI, machine learning, pushes things forward, yet stays responsible and looks at the bigger picture implication of things?
Yeah, I think there are a growing number of organizations that are taking this really seriously. I know, I can't think of the organization now, but Joey Ito, who was the former director of the MIT Media Lab, has an organization that's focused on this idea of ethics and AI. And the Wilson, there's a Wilson Council as well that does work similar to the Atlantic Council. But I think we do need more attention and more focus on the issues of ethics. And the question is, because it can be weaponized so freely, do other countries and that state actors necessarily have the same concerns about ethics that we do? And the assumption is that they don't, but we don't. I think the scary thing is we don't necessarily know. So it's unknown.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would love to hear a little bit. You shared with us before we went live. You have a manifesto you put together, the Superhuman Age Manifesto. We're going to get that out, so the viewers can take a look at that. But I would love to hear some of your favorite points that are hit upon. One thing that stands out to me, just looking at it briefly here, is you mentioned in it, AI is the new UI. I would love to hear you elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, I think that's something I've given a lot of thought. Having just, I started working in technology in 1989. So it was very early. It was before the internet, which freaks people out. My kids, at least, when I tell them, no, I started working in tech at least before the graphical internet was born, which I peg at about 1993. And, there have been just a tremendous number of changes along that time. But one of the evolutions that we've seen is this sort of evolution of the interface. And again, I'll quote or I'll sort of harken back to Marshall McLuhan, where he said, the things we make us. Anytime we start using tools and building things, we end up adapting ourselves to those things. And so we learn to program and create batch commands. And we got carpal tunnel syndrome from typing on our keyboards. But it's like, why am I typing on my keyboard? I told a story a couple of years ago about my daughter when she was about 18 months. And this was very early in the touch interface when, she was born in 2005. So before the iPhone was even out, right? And I caught her one time in the in the living room, and she was trying to swipe her hand across the TV. I'm like, "What are you doing? Stop touching the rapidly depreciating asset. What are you doing?" And she's like, "I want to watch Barney." So she was trying to change the channel, and I stopped and said, "No, no, no. Here's first you have this. This is the remote control for the stereo. This goes to the cable box. This is how you turn the TV on. This is how you do all this." And she looked at me like I was crazy. And that's just one of those moments where I'm like, "Yeah, why does it work like this? Why can't I just walk in like we can now and say, 'Hey, turn on Barney. I want to watch Barney. Turn it on.'" And it shouldn't even need, the buttons shouldn't need our effort to even react. Like the interface is becoming more ambient, but that does require an AI type system that's meeting us more than halfway, better than Alexa, better than Siri, these things are improving, right? And we'll get to the point where when you walk into a room, it does, like in Bill Gates' home, I imagine, the artwork changes to suit you and the ambiance changes. And eventually when we have AR, the whole world's going to be the way you want it. And so again, there's potential for negative outcomes there where our bubbles get even bubblier, right? Where we're just like, I'm only seeing my little world and I don't even see your world anymore. But I do think the age of us adapting to the tech, we need to have this stuff adapting back to us and helping us. And like I said, the key sort of driver for me, the user story for people using the brain that we put inside of places like RTI or Blue Cross Blue Shield or the 58 community colleges or wherever, is that it should surprise you with things you didn't know you need. So it shouldn't require you to be adept at search. It should bring something to you and say, "Hey, it looks like you're working on this project. Here's this thing I brought you. And by the way, it's on the other side of this firewall. It requires you go talk to Tony. Tony will get you access to this thing you would never have known even existed, but it has this really high value number on it based on what I know about you. I think you need that thing or that person or that whatever that information object resource is." And that's what I mean by the interface becoming ambient.
What you're what you're saying makes me think of a joke I always say, is that I think the movie WALL-E is probably going to be the greatest predictor of the future, just because I imagine that AR and people not having to do anything, we're just going to be all floating around in our chairs constantly
being entertained.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different competing views, but the one I still adopt, and this is what I wrote about in 2013 in TechCrunch, was Hans Moravec's view, which is it's not machines replacing us or just watching over us with loving grace, but instead it's us humans evolving in more potent form. So these things are already extensions of us, and as someone who's really good and adept at search today on these devices is arguably more intelligent, more capable than someone who's saying I don't use that stuff, right? But it'll even be more pronounced as it becomes more ambient. And I'm just walking down the street with the glasses like this in New York, and I have my little brain pal say, well, you can keep walking on this street, but if you walk, and you have a 24% chance of having a negative interaction with a street hustler or something, or you can walk one block over and it goes down to 7. Now I can decide not to take that advice, but it could manage my day like that if I wanted to, help me make all the decisions I'm going to be making every single day.
What do you think about the whole Neuralink piece and us actually merging with technology?
Well, like I said, I think it's really happening already. I think we're becoming, these are exocortical extensions already. And soon, I know at Research Triangle Institute here in North Carolina, this guy named Robert Furberg, who's implanting stuff in him now, in himself, to quantify his health and activity and that sort of thing. And then it's not much of a leap from there to talk about communications between mesh networks between people with embedded things. In fact, I did work on a DARPA project back in 2010 called Cognitive Coupling. And it was about brain-to-brain interfaces. And I was surprised how far we'd taken it then. I haven't been involved with how far it's gone since then, but I knew then it was possible for a team of people. For me, if the three of us were dropped in somewhere, I could sense your readiness level, your anxiety level, and all that, and could think about ways that I could make you more effective by increasing one of those things. And it might even be chemically. Tony needs a little burst of oxytocin to go engage with that villager, or Andy needs a little more testosterone and maybe some adrenaline because he's got a fight ahead of him. We're already there, or have been for some time. So, how does that leak over into the commercial world? I don't know yet. But
yeah, I do usually have to get into fights during my daily hunting routine, but
hopefully not. Hopefully it can also help you avoid them.
Exactly. So I'm curious to get into the balance now between tech and business. So obviously we're here as the founder show, but you're obviously so deep in tech and the future. How have you, I guess, how does it work for you, that balance between, where there's technology and invention and innovation and creating business and profit and revenue and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, there is some business in being a futurist, but it's mostly about speaking and writing books. To me, that's not a business I'm interested in. I'd rather, I like it, but anytime someone calls me a futurist, I always say, no, I'm not. I'm a nowist. So I'm interested in what can be applied right now, or, it's William Gibson says a lot of this stuff is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So I just want to more evenly distribute things that I know are already working. So, for example, this idea of animated personas, applying that to selling Coca-Cola and insurance products and whatever in market research, which is a $3 billion industry. Well, we've been doing this modeling of human behavior and positions in the DoD for decades. So all I'm doing is taking that and mapping it over to a different industry. So it's not really in the future. Like I said, it's just unevenly distributed. When I was at Lockheed, we were modeling, the entire country of Afghanistan, and we wouldn't say that there are 4 kinds of people. You've got your Taliban, you got your Sunnis, you got your Shias, you got your whatever. We would end up with like 5,000 different independent viewpoints, and like how many of each? Like if I draw a ring around Helmand Province, how many different different groups of viewpoints do I have? And how are they going to feel about me building a school for girls there? Some of them are fine with it. Some of them are neutral. And then these guys are all red over here, and they're going to go and blow up the school. So I need to keep an eye on them, right? So we've been doing that for a while. And that's where I think the money is. And I think even RPA, I believe, is already commoditized in my view. If you're not looking across your organization and figuring out everywhere where you can do process automation instead of having people like doing insurance reimbursement codes or reviewing loan agreements or lease agreements. There's that famous JP Morgan story that we were sort of tangential to many years back, where they were spending at the time 310,000 hours a year of New York lawyer time just reviewing loan agreements. And I'm like, well, let's say it's $800 an hour. Well, that's almost $300 million of an expense that's built into your P&L. It's built into your stock price, just an assumed cost everybody has. Well, they implemented something, I forgot the name of it now, but within about, let's say it costs $2 million in less than a year, and they never have that cost again. So think about that. A one-time, just from a business perspective, a one-time investment of $2 million that removes the $300 million cost and pays that annually. It's an annuity every year from that point on. So JP Morgan got religion on that very fast and is doing that for everything they can find within their organization. Hopefully those New York lawyers are all okay. I don't know if we need to do a GoFundMe or take care of them.
Yeah, right. Well, I was going to ask that to the next piece of that pie is when process automation, AI impact employment rates.
Yeah.
So I've always thought about that, and how do we change and adapt? And it's so interesting because right now it's such a hot job market, but I keep thinking there's got to be a cliff somewhere.
Well, I mean, we've been predicting, again, smart people sitting around trying to predict stuff. We thought, hey, we're going to see double-digit Dow returns and we're going to see double-digit unemployment. That's just going to be miserable really soon, and we got to get ready for it. And I've been saying that since 2014, and it's not happening. the pandemic is was a blip, but it really isn't happening. But the way to really think about it is, the Industrial Revolution created the same problem for us with technology. It's just that we had 200 years to adapt to it. So in 1800, 90% of everybody in the US was a farmer or involved in farming. And then in 1900, it was like 40%. Today, it's 2%. So we found something else for people to do, but we had 200 years to make that adjustment. The problem is today is we've got like a decade, maybe. I was on the board of trustees until recently for 8 years of a community college called Wake Tech here in North Carolina with 70,000 students. When I looked across the programs and I would just see, I'll just choose one like radiology. I'm like, wait, so you've got humans, you're training people to read x-rays. No, stop it right now. We already have, again, I'm a nowist. We already have technologies that are way, way better, like 2 orders of magnitude better than any human being at reading an x-ray. Why in the hell would you go into that? Don't go into that job. It's not going to be a job soon. It's not a job now, right? And everyone's looking at me like, oh, you're from the future. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm telling you now. It exists now. I just got to plug a machine in here. And you don't have a job, so don't invest your time in that. So the question now is like, what sorts of things will we do? But we are finding things. But is it going to be disruptive? Yes.
Yeah, I always think so. I'm curious about the process for you when someone comes to you and says, we have a problem. Where do you start? Is it is it breaking apart all the questions? Is it just mind mapping it? How do you start when an organization, whether government or, commercial, comes to you and says, how do I solve this problem?
Sure. Well, again, the process automation bit is the easiest one. It's like, what are you doing today? Let's look. And we've often even said, maybe you need a new kind of person in your organization called Chief Resource Officer that's just looking across everything that your people are doing and trying to look, oh, that's something that we could do with the machine today. So let's move those people to a different role or have fewer of them, and let's go ahead and automate that. And you could say, well, I want to keep people employed. And it's like, but then if you're up against someone like JP Morgan who has that mindset, you're going to be a dinosaur so fast. You'll be like Kodak, in the photo industry, just out of business pretty soon. So we always look at that first. And then the second thing I always look at is like, okay, what about your organizational knowledge? People always look at me like, what? It's like, think about like Salesforce, but for knowledge, right? You invest a lot in your people and stuff, and you have turnover of people. Like here in the North Carolina, for example, of the 58 community colleges, over the last 3 years, we have 20 new presidents. So what happens when those people leave or faculty leave or whatever? Well, you've lost knowledge that you gained in the information age at probably great expense. So when the new person comes in, do they have to rebuild it all over again? Or what if there was a little bot there that had the model and the map of the previous president and said, well, when Dr. Scott ran his first, board of trustees meeting, here are the information objects and people he went to and what he found useful. And you can follow that map, or you can build your own, but at least it's there as a comfort sort of training wheels thing if you want it. And it's not lost to the organization. And then the third one is, if you're selling to customers, how well do you know them? And what if you could, if you're Coca-Cola, why not have a little Sims world running all the time where you're testing new product ideas in there instead of trying to A/B test with polls and surveys, which we know are flawed. Instead, let's have data built models of people and then run your A/B testing in there. And again, because it's machines, you don't have to run 8 experiments. You can run 10 to the 8th. So those are the things I go through that progression and go like, okay, there's always like, every time we do an instance, it's like, we end up with this list of 20 things. It's like, let's prioritize them now. And which ones do you want to do first?
Richard, I would love to go back for just a second to discuss the idea of mindset, because despite the fact of the speed of everything advancing so fast, it seems to me like in order to harness the power of machine learning, it really does take a shift in perspective to be able to know what are the questions to ask, applications of this type of tech. technology. So how do we, in order to, gain more buy-in for more businesses, how do we address that? Because again, I think it's forcing people to look at things very differently. And I imagine that's a challenge for gaining buy-in and adoption and things along those lines. But
yeah, no, that's very true. Like that's what we learned. I learned this lesson a long time ago because I've always been. Someone at one point said, "Oh, I think it was actually James Cameron told me, it's like, Richard, you like inventing technologies out in the future and putting a stake in the ground and dragging yourself to it. It's like that's not a good way to live." And I'm like, you're right. Instead, I think it's like I said, it's more of that sort of nowist mentality of what works today and how can you apply it today. But change management is always a big part of these implementations. So if you forget that piece, you're going to have a difficult time. Even when I talk about the 58 community colleges here, like there's a lot of distrust, like, hey, is this thing reading my emails? Is it doing this? Or am I losing privacy? And it's like, well, we can put governors around it to convince you that's not the case. But can it read your emails? Yes. We're going to prevent it by policy from doing that. But you have to invest in change management because it is, like I said, incredibly powerful and incredibly intimate, and therefore needs governance around it. Change management is something that has to be invested in. That's its own specialized skill. How do you take people through that? Go back to my kale example of, you don't just abruptly, I was a meat eater and then I became a vegetarian, or I was a Republican and I became a Democrat because of that well-crafted email. That's not how it happens. It happens with this slow sort of micro adoption of ideas that build upon each other until you finally reach this new, mindset. And we can do it. Like I said, it's surprisingly easy to do. So great care must be taken to make sure you are, like in our case, and the work that we're doing with COVID is trying to move people to understand wherever they start with their perspective that here's why you should wear a mask or get vaccines, and here's the benefit, and you couch, and everybody's message path is different. And that you can't just do like one campaign. It's got to be all these micro campaigns around groups to move them. And some of them you'll never get them over to the other side where they're eating kale every day. But you can move them to dark green vegetables are a little better for me. I should eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Instead of I'm going vegan today, like James Cameron did.
So what's the future hold for your organization? What do you see happening over the next couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I expect that there's going to be, like I've seen in previous technology movements, there will be some kind of consolidation in these spaces. So small companies like mine will likely become parts of other organizations. But we're still finding our way. And we've tried to really, the biggest problem with most small companies is that, God, there's so many opportunities out there to apply the tech, and you really have to focus in on a few things. So you've heard me talk about knowledge amplification, organizational knowledge, and then the animated personas. And we're not doing that much process automation because I think it's already commoditized. So I think you're going to see consolidation. But I think if you watch what Google's doing with GPT-3, where machines are getting really, really good at fooling people into believing that they're a real person. So getting closer and closer to that Turing test solution, at least if it's contextual, that's gonna have some broad-reaching implications, about trust and about, but on the other side of it, on a positive side, it's having really, really good virtual assistants around you that are helping you all the time. They might become annoying, but you can also just silence them and their feelings don't get hurt. But you could have little bots. And I really like what Doc Searle talks about in his Intention Economy book, the idea that, instead of me being bombarded with ads, where it's all about monetizing human attention, which is what Facebook and LinkedIn and everybody are all about, instead we turn it the other way, where I'm putting out little mini RFPs. I've got little bots out there always looking for, this kind of vacation or this kind of Hugo Boss, 40 regular jacket at a certain price. And it's just always out there searching for me, or certain kinds of information or connections or whatever. These things doing my bidding instead of me having to be good at search and sitting here typing. I'm getting surprised by these artificially intelligent systems that are tuned to my values, my goals, and are trying to help me get there. I think that's a really positive outcome, and I want to help that become a reality.
It's a very cool concept of kind of flipping the script on, everything that's currently happening and, kind of reversing. That's really interesting to think about. Before we ask, I think what'll be our last question here, Richard, where can our viewers learn more about you, more about Tanjo? We are going to share, we already sent that, your Medium article, your manifesto out. But,
yeah, I was writing for Medium for a while. Now LinkedIn has become more of a prominent place to place ideas and to have congress with other people who have similar ideas. So I'm doing more and more of that. By the way, Reid Hoffman was an investor in my last company, the one I sold to Lockheed. So I'm like one of the first 1,000 users of LinkedIn. I'm not sure I use it as adeptly as I should, but when I think about things and I decide it's worth sharing, I usually put it there. So just find me on LinkedIn. On Twitter, I'm Metaversial, METAVERSIAL. So at Metaversial, where I share ideas as well. And I have a little website where I give advice for those of you who are parents and are also technologists. I created a site for my son, who's now 9, the day he was born. And I've been out there collecting advice from people like James Cameron and Nolan Bushnell and Douglas Adams and folks like that, and putting it into that site. So it's just deardylan.com.
Very cool.
Yeah, very cool. So the question I ask everybody that's on the show, and definitely, you've talked about a lot, so you may have somewhat answered this, but I want to hear from our tech founders. What do you think over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be the one technology that's the most society changing? Is it machine learning, AI? Is it augmented reality? Is it language processing? What do you think is that piece that is going to make the biggest impact?
Yeah, I'm still, the reason I left my overpaid job at Lockheed to do another startup with all the sweat and the fear and everything, is because I strongly believe that machine learning and AI, especially in areas like education, are going to be incredibly transformative. There'll be a time when, if let's say we were all together in person, I would say well, there's 3 of us here, but I think in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be at least, 9 entities in this conversation. Only 3 of us will be human, and each of us will have sort of augmented intelligence from systems that are listening, grabbing stuff. And so while I'm talking to you and or while you're talking to me and I talk about Douglas Adams or Alan Kay or Herbert Simon or whatever, and you go like, man, I don't know who that is. Your system is then bringing data up, and it may be on your screen or it may be in your augmented reality sort of floating field out here where it's augmenting the conversation. And I've seen good demonstrations of that already. And that's not necessarily the magic leap approach, who, really trying to do, and I've seen the early demonstrations of their augmented reality, and it's mostly focused on entertainment, and they're really trying to solve the unstructured environment Z buffering problem, which they said they solved a long time ago, but I see $2 billion and a decade later, it's still not working. So I don't know, good on them for collecting that much money. But I really think this idea of just having this web of deeper information around my conversations in my world, even as I'm walking down the street, is going to be incredibly empowering and transformative. It's the Young Ladies Illustrated primer from Neil Stephenson's Diamond Age.
Wow, this has been a fascinating conversation, Richard. We're here at the hour mark, so we're probably can go a lot longer with you, because again, this has been fantastic. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. So thank you. And to our viewers, thank you for joining. We will see you guys again next week.
No, I enjoyed admiring problems with you, and hopefully we'll all make some better solutions together.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. We'll see you
Cheers.
next time.